Hello everyone, my name is Carly Gotts and I'm the General Manager for Botanica. And today I'm joined by garden historian, author and botanical guide Dr. Toby Musgrave. Toby has recently released a book called The Multifarious Mr. Banks, which explores many of the incredible contributions that Banks has made to the scientific world. Welcome, Toby.
Oh, thanks, Carly. It's nice to be talking about an Englishman to Australians who know more about him than we do.
I know. Well, that's it. Toby, of course, you're based in Denmark, so thank you very much for joining us today. And as you say, in Australia, many of us did study, obviously, Cook's famous voyage on the Endeavour to Australia. And of course, Joseph Banks was the botanist aboard that ship. And he obviously made an incredible contribution to documenting the botany of our country. But I'm fascinated to learn more about his life today, as he really was quite a remarkable man, as you explore in your book.
Thanks, Carly. Thanks for the introduction. And yeah, it's a strange book to have written by an Englishman, I think, because Australians and New Zealanders know much more about Banks than we do up here. He's kind of a forgotten hero, I think, in the British subconscious or the British history. Maybe if you're a botanist or heard of Kew Gardens, people may have heard of Banks, but he's certainly not as well respected as he should be. So that's kind of the reason why I wrote the book, was to try and put him back into center stage a little bit. The book covers his whole life. It's a biography, and obviously a big part of that is the journey to Australia, New Holland, on that circumnavigation with Cook, 1768 to 1771. But I think that's the best known part of his story. So I wanted to just very much briefly do a backstory to that, and then really focus on his life when he came back to Britain after his voyage, because I think the Cook expedition was the sort of glam phase of his life. But I think what he did after he came back was actually has more of a legacy and a resonance and an impact that we still feel today than perhaps the voyage itself did. So Banks came from a landed family. They weren't gentry, they were on their way up, but they were very wealthy. And this was the family estate in Revesby in Lincolnshire, which he didn't actually spend too much time at, either as a child or an adult life. Some people have described it as rather architecturally challenged. He was packed off to private school, Harrow and Eton, and then he went to Christ Church College, Oxford, in these years 1760 to 1764. Quite unusual for a man of his time. He actually did bother to study. Most young men went to Oxford or Cambridge and didn't really do much except say they'd been there. But like many of his contemporaries, he didn't actually graduate with a degree. He left having not completed his studies, but he did study, and his subject was botany, which was so badly taught at the time that he actually had to import a tutor from Cambridge, the other place, to teach them botany. After graduating, he spent some time in London, in Chelsea, living at his mother's place. And sort of started to, I guess you'd say, self-study these days. He decided that he wanted to pursue natural history as a subject, but I don't think he really knew what he wanted to do with it. But a fortuitous set of circumstances came about in 1766 when he heard about an expedition to Newfoundland. There was a Royal Naval vessel going up there to establish a fort and to look at the fisheries up there. There was a sort of conflict going on between the British, the Spanish, and the French, and he managed to get a trip on that ship along with a chum of his from school, and who was also a Navy man. And that kind of sort of sowed the seed, if you like, for Banks. He put his theoretical knowledge into practice, and actually made a successful trip in that trip to Newfoundland, 1766 to 67. And I think that really sort of showed him what could be achieved by natural history being part of a naval voyage, particularly a voyage of discovery. So Banks put his theoretical knowledge that he'd been learning in London since he left university in practice when he went on the Niger trip. And it turned out to be a very successful trip, and it also proved to himself that he had either the knowledge and the ability to carry out scientific research, but also to do it within the confines of working on a small naval vessel. When Banks got back, he got wind of this really amazing expedition that he had to be part of. And that was the Great Cook expedition that went in 1768 to 1771. And we know the story of this. This is the glam part. Of course, two highlights of that was to prove that New Zealand was two islands, the first circumnavigation, the landing at Botany Bay and claiming a lot of land for Britain. James Cook and Banks sailed on this minuscule little ship, the Endeavour. This is the reproduction or the replica of the Endeavour in Sydney. Cook looking rather glum at the top there. I've been around it a couple of times, and it just amazes me that how small it is, and how Banks and Cook, two very different people personality-wise, and also from where they came in the structure of class society at the time, were able to rub along together and get on so well. Yet another example, I think, of Banks's ability just to get on with everybody, from a king to native peoples who'd never seen a white person before. And I think that's one of the things that managed to get how he managed to get on the trip in the first place, was because he wasn't part of the expedition, but he saw the opportunity for natural history as part of this voyage. A couple of things happened where he was lucky, but also it was the strength of his personality, his persuasiveness, his he just had this personality where he got on with people and made things happen. But also he had the eye for an opportunity. And in this case, I think it was also very much that he was prepared to pay for the trip himself. This is looking a reverse of the shot from before. This is the main cabin at the back of the master's cabin at the back of the ship. Just on the right-hand side there, you can see a couple of ropes. And that's the space that Banks lived in for 3 years, a tiny, tiny part of the cabin at the back of the ship. So we won't go into the whole story about the success and near wrecking of the ship on the Endeavour Reef and all that. That's the familiar story. The other thing that's in Australia, in the State Library in New South Wales, is the actual journal that Banks made. One of the things I found when I was writing this book, which is really, really disappointing, was against Banks's wishes when he died. His papers were supposed to go to the British Museum in London, but they were sold off by a relative of his wife, and they're dispersed across, I think it's 50 institutions around the world, and we don't know how much is lost. Thankfully, some has survived, including this journal, but it's one of those things that I wish someone would do a project where they bring all the information together like they've done with the Darwin archive. One of the things that is fun, if you're interested, I think they're still running it in Sydney. There's a sort of, it's not crowdfunding, but it's crowd working. So you can actually sign up and help decipher some of Banks's letters and what have you, so that they can put the transcripts up online, which is a great thing to get involved in. This is actually the page when they leave the country in 1768 in August. Of course, there was botany going on the whole way around. So Banks was the first to botanize New Zealand and Australia properly. Banksia, the genus named for him by Carl Linnaeus the Younger. Apparently, originally the whole continent was going to be called Banksia, but it ended up being Australia. This is a lovely plate that's been produced. And one of the things Banks was really, really bad at was actually writing up his research. So he should have published this huge Florigelium, which would have put him amongst the sort of greatest scientists of the day. But it never happened. He had all the plates engraved, and there was supposed to be this sort of 15 volumes that came out with these beautiful, beautiful plates. But it never came out in his lifetime. Some of them were used for a revamp of the Australian and New Zealand flora, I beg your pardon, in the turn of the 20th century. But the whole colour plates were not actually finished published until 1990, sort of, very sad, but they're just beautiful. The plates that you see here are actually using the original plates that were cut for the book. When he came back, I think the sort of success of Banks's trip went to his head a little bit, and he sort of, as I think the phrase these days was, he started to believe his own publicity. He was feted around town, and everyone was saying the whole journey was Banks's success rather than Cook's. And he was slated to go on Cook's second voyage, but he got a bit of an ego trip and eventually sort of threw his toys out of the pram and decided not to go. Instead, he took a little journey up to Iceland in June to October 1772. Not a good time for botany, but he saw some interesting things. And one of the things that he did there, as I said, he had this ability to sort of get on with people. And the Icelanders really liked him, and he liked the Icelanders. And during the sort of Napoleonic Wars, Banks came to their rescue because it was part of the Danish realm at the time. And the ships that were taking supplies up there kept on getting taken by the Brits. the Royal Navy, and he actually went to the king to petition that food be allowed through to save the Icelanders. And I think it's another example of one of those things about Banks. He was an incredibly honourable man. I mean, he had all this money, he had all this power and prestige, this network that was global, yet he always did the right thing in later life. For example, when the Napoleonic Wars were going on, ships would be captured by the British, and the scientific collections, if there were them on board, would go to Banks. And he could have just taken credit for them himself, but he always made sure that they went back to the intended recipient, saying that science was above war. And he got a lot of grief for that at the time. It was sort of called unpatriotic because, you know, he was siding with the enemy, as it were. This picture here is because this is a bust of Banks, but what it's on is the rockery at the Chelsea Physic Garden, and the rocks there came from Iceland. They were part of the ballast that was brought back on the ship, also parts in Kew as well. So when Banks came back to London, he settled down, when he came back to Britain, he settled down in London. He had a smaller country house outside London at Spring Grove, which is quite close to Kew. And this became his hub. He had this huge amount of money and he put it into science. Behind the house at Soho Square, he had his own private library, his herbarium. And I guess the way you call it today, he basically established his own scientific research institute, funded by himself, but he threw his doors open so people could come and use the resources there. And it wasn't just plants, it was natural history in general. He had Europe's best library, natural history library. And he was very much about this interchange of ideas, this dissemination of ideas, and this whole sort of science being a global pastime. But Britain always had to be first. So, you know, there was a little nationalism going on about it as well. But he was a very generous man with his resources. One of the other things that he got involved very, very much soon after his return from the second trip, if you like, his own trip in 1772, was he became good friends with King George III, Farmer George, and started to develop the Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew. There'd been a royal palace at Kew for ages, and there's quite a long backstory in terms of a garden being developed there and a physic garden, a collection of medical plants and a sort of small botanical collection. But Banks saw the opportunity for Kew to become the world's premier botanic garden, a position it still holds today. And he did this for two reasons. One was to show that Britain had the best collection of living plants, or the king did, the best live collection in the world. Plus also this idea of pushing forward the science and boundaries of science, in this case botany, for Kew to become the world's premier botanic garden, a position it still holds today. And he did this for two reasons. One was to show that Britain had the best collection of living plants, or the king did, the best live collection in the world. Plus also this idea of pushing forward the science and boundaries of science, in this case botany. In Australia, there's a good collection down, particularly his journals and what have you. Banks had this policy of sending out plant hunters. He used people who'd been trained at Kew, plus contacts and friends he had around the world who would send him back materials. So yes, there was an active plant hunting policy. Francis Masson was the first one to go out. He went to South Africa and various other places later. Archibald Minges went with Captain Vancouver. Interesting story about how they fell out. William Roxburgh was a correspondent in India who sent material back. He worked for the East India Company. So did Wallich. He was a surgeon. And Cunningham was one of the other plant hunters who went to Australia. And it really worked as a hub and spoke thing. So Kew was the hub. Material was sent back to Kew, whether it was from a botanical garden that had been set up by the East India Company or by the colonies. And then Kew was the sorting house, if you like. And the useful plants were then redistributed throughout the empire. This economic transfer, perhaps the one of Banks's heroic failures, if you like, was the first attempted transfer of breadfruit from Tahiti to be used as a food source for the slaves working the plantations in West Indies, the sugar plantations. And we all know the story of Captain Bligh being cast off the Bounty in that tiny little boat, and then ending up back in Australia for the Rum Revolution as the Governor General down there. Didn't have a huge. I mean, he was. I think personality-wise, I think Banks and Bligh were very dissimilar, but he was very much a protege of Banks's. But Banks did work all the time for this idea of bringing groups together, whether it was the East India Company and Kew, which was obviously a private royal garden, the government. He just developed this incredible network of people, of contacts, of friends, of influential people. And he was this, I suppose you call it this master puppeteer, that he knew who to talk to and who to put in contact with each other. And as I said earlier on, this idea, he saw ideas and then managed to make them happen by having this network of contacts, plus this ability to take a project and see it through. He was a great manager. And one of the roles he performed as a very good manager was the president of the Royal Society. Yes, there were complaints that he was a bit dictatorial and what have you, but he was president of the Royal Society for 42 years, and he's still the longest serving president of that. That gave him the kudos, and his friendship with the king also helped. They were very good chums. And as you start to see his second half of his life, if you like, after the the Cook expedition, you start to see this man who is a mover and a shaker, but always done for the betterment of Britain. He was very much an Enlightenment man, but he was also very much a pro-colonialist man. He was actually abolitionist in his attitudes towards slavery, but he always saw that the colonies were there to make money for the British. So there was that sort of the British back home. So there was always that sort of sense of improvement that he was trying to push forward. And this is just a list of some of the associations that he was a member of. So the Board of Longitude and the Royal Observatory, he came with his presidency of the Royal Society. So he was very much pro this idea of, he was all with Harrison and trying to push forward that discovery of a way of figuring out longitude. Hands-on at the Royal Observatory. Most people who are on the board never bothered to turn up. He always did. He became elected a Privy Councillor, so was advising the king officially through that. One of the things he never did was he never ever became a politician. He never stood for Parliament. His ancestors had. He said he could achieve more without that taint of being one side or the other. But he always managed brilliantly to work with both sides of the house, as it were. And that was one of his skills, that he saw these people as friends, as colleagues, as people he would talk to, fellow landed gentry. Once again, I keep coming back to this fact that his personality was just warm. I think he had this ability to work what he wanted, but that's not to say he suffered fools gladly. I mean, there are a couple of occasions where things didn't go the way he wanted to, and he came down like a ton of bricks. One was Captain Vancouver on that trip with Archibald Mingus, who was confined to his cabin and lost a lot of his plant collections. And Banks basically ruined Vancouver's career for a while after that. The Board of Trade was an important one. That was, again, a quasi-official appointment. You could call Banks a sort of unelected Minister of Science, I suppose you could say. The Board of Trade was also very much looking at self-sufficiency for food. In Britain, when we were having the Napoleonic Wars, he helped revitalize the Royal Mint, bringing copper coins in. He's one of the founders of the Ordnance Survey, and that's the whole mapping of Britain. So that was something that we still have today. The maps, the Ordnance Survey maps, came out of Banks. He was a person who set up the first, or worked to get the first geographical survey of Britain. He was part of the African Association, again, sense of colonialism there with Mungo Park's expeditions, Royal Institution and Education. He was, again, he was always careful not to cross barriers. So he was very much pro the Linnaean Society setting up, but he wasn't a founder member because he saw a level of conflict of interest between that and the Royal Society, of which he was very, very protective. But he was a founder member of the Royal Horticultural Society in 1804, trustee of the National History Museum, and put money into projects, personal money. So he funded Strata Smith to a part of creating the first geological map of the United Kingdom. So one of the things I think about Banks is that he just had this level of interest. He was just perennially interested about finding out information. But then when he had the information, he also found ways of using it. Just a couple of other references to an Australian side of the coin, if you like. He's often called the father of Australia. It was, I think it's right to say that the evidence that Banks gave to the Bunbury Committee in 1779 was what drove the First Fleet, that idea to put a penal colony in Australia. He gave it the large. I think he buttered it up a little bit, made it sound better than perhaps it was, because he'd really only spent 6 days in Botany Bay and it hadn't been that great. So I think he did spin it a bit. But it was his evidence that really finally convinced the government that New Holland was the place to put this penal colony. And the evidence was given in 1779, but of course it was much later that the First Fleet set sail, and it was Banks also after that that was so important for the foundation, if you like. I mean, once the First Fleet had gone out, it was Banks back in England who had the colonies back, if you like. There was a lot going on in Britain at the time. We were having the Napoleonic Wars were going on, so the colonies were a little bit on the they weren't forgotten about, but they weren't top of the agenda. And Banks was absolutely critical in making sure that supplies got out there. He was in correspondence with all the early governors and had other plant collectors sending him back information. And it was him who, again, funded privately sending ships out, or the material that went out on the ships. So I think whether it's one of those hypothetical things that one could argue and see if Banks hadn't been quite so proactive in making sure supplies got to Australia or to Sydney Cove, whether the colony would have survived the way it did, because times were tough at the early. This is an 1804 picture of Sydney Cove. And coming back to our things here, one of the other aspects of the Board of Trade that he was very involved with was this idea of getting Australia to export back to Britain. And there were problems there because the East India Company had a monopoly on everything that came into Britain from the East. And obviously they were not particularly happy that Australia was starting to export. So again, Banks was back in London, lobbying government to say, look, we've got this place, they can start to export stuff. We need to be able to export stuff from Australia to make it a viable entity. He wanted Australia to be self-sufficient as quickly as possible. Plant transfers and plant discoveries weren't as great as he thought they were going to be. I know it's a New Zealand plant, but the New Zealand flax industry didn't turn out the way he wanted to do, and he thought there would be more economic plants in Australia than there turned out to be. But you can't win every time if you're at the cutting edge of stuff. But also one of the other things with the Board of Trade was the whole helping along the Australian wool industry. Banks was a farmer. He was very much in favour of agricultural improvement. He was very active in that in his own estate in Revesby with fen clearance and fen drainage. And he saw the advantages of merino wool. And he was the first to actually get merino sheep into Britain. They were stolen and smuggled out of Spain via Portugal. And they went to the King's flock. But he saw the advantages of it. And then when MacArthur managed to acquire a few sheep and start the Australian wool industry, he was very pro MacArthur when MacArthur came to London to talk about getting more land and increasing the sheep runs. Banks was very pro that, although MacArthur wasn't very nice to Banks, because Banks also suffered really badly from gout. So when MacArthur turned up, he went to see Banks, and Banks didn't see him because he was prostrate with gout. And MacArthur got rather snippy about it and rather rude, which was not what Banks was trying to do. He wasn't trying to put him off. And it was also Banks's work that got a lot of those movements about developing the land for sheep grazing, but also starting the horticulture down there, sending a couple of botanists down there, plant hunters who also settled in Australia. So I think it's sort of one of the things that I keep putting this slide up because it's just trying to remind me and maybe also you that the Banks was involved in so many of these activities that were being carried out in Britain, but he was kind of behind the scenes. Yes, he was president of the Royal Society, which I mentioned gave him that sort of level of kudos. His friendship with the king very much helped, because as president of the Royal Society, he was also one of the scientific advisors to the king. A lot of the rest of the Royal Society, some of them didn't like him because he wasn't a mathematician or an astronomer He was a sort of botanist. One of the things he didn't do an awful lot of was publish. He wasn't a sort of active hands-on scientist. He did produce a couple of rather interesting articles for the Royal Horticultural Society early journal, which kind of get overlooked. And he also was the person who figured out how rust, the rust in wheat was transmitted. But he published a paper on that, but it wasn't proven until about 100 years after he died that he was actually right. But I think where Banks was most influential was making things happen. He was a maker. He was a mover and a shaker. And if he may not have necessarily had the stellar scientific career, I mean, he wasn't he didn't discover oxygen. He didn't discover how blood circulated. There were a load of other scientists of his time, his peers, who were making these incredible scientific breakthroughs. But he was very much part of that time where he was enabling those people to do that. He was a great supporter of oh, for goodness sake, I forgot his name. The chap who invented the safety lamp, Harvey, and a scientist who followed him as the president of the Royal Society. He was a great supporter of various astronomers, Herschel, for example. And I think it's also why in the 19th century he kind of fell off the radar, because at a time when science started to become more disciplinary, science became not natural history, but physics, chemistry, botany, and more specialized. There wasn't anything you could say about Banks that was, yes, Banks was invented this, or Banks discovered that. So he was kind of looked on in the 19th century as a bit of a tinkerer, if you like. He was sort of jack of all trades and a master of none. He sort of dabbled, which was looked down on in the 19th century. But if it hadn't been for the work he'd done in enabling these other scientists, then science wouldn't have developed the way it did. One of the last things I wanted to say was very much about where we are today in terms of Banks. He established the Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew as the premier botanic gardens, and it went into a decline after Banks died, but it's once again the world's premier botanical garden. So that's a legacy that lives with us. The societies that he formed or founded, or was a founder member of, still with us. Linnean Society, the Royal Horticultural Society, and in the 19th century, Royal Society was very much, the Horticultural Society was very much a hands-on scientific establishment as well. But I think perhaps one of the greatest legacies he had goes right back to what I said right at the start about that trip on the Niger up to Newfoundland, and that idea that Banks saw the potential of having scientists as part of these voyages of discovery. And throughout his career, when he was back in London, he was the pioneer of that, and he would be the one who would writing all the protocols that should go with these expeditions and appointing the scientists or advising who should be appointed as scientists. So including the circumnavigation of Flinders with the team on board that. It was very much about using these voyages of discovery not only as a means of advancing colonial control and geographic exploration, but also the advances in the natural sciences. And I think that's one thing you can look right up to today. This is his swan song. So when he was crippled with gout in 1818, he died in 1820. This was the last voyage for which he was sort of hands-on, and this was sending the voyage up to look for the Northwest Passage. There were 4 ships went up, and sadly he died before the return to say that the voyage, well, they hadn't found the Northwest Passage, but it had been a hugely successful trip, and the biggest piece of land that they found, they named Banks. It's now Banks Island. But that legacy lives with us. Even today with the RSS Sir David Attenborough, which was launched in 2021, the whole raison d'etre for that ship is science. So you can draw a red thread directly between Banks and that establishment of a new paradigm of science aboard ships right up to today. And I also finish with that slide because Sir David Attenborough is also a huge, great fan of Joseph Banks. And I think he is forgotten about up in this part of the world, in Britain, and he shouldn't be. You guys are far better at remembering him, perhaps because of the Australia connections and also the Cook expedition. But I think he's someone beyond the sort of glamour of that first voyage when he was this young, dashing chap, as you see from the portraits of him when he was younger. As a mature gentleman and in later life, he was incredibly influential, kind of behind the scenes, but very much in power of making science, moving science forward. And just the last thing I'd say, he did that for no personal gain. He could have retired to his family estates with more money than he could ever spend and lived the life of Riley, create a great garden with capability, Brown come in and do it. But he didn't. He dedicated his life to science and pushing forward the boundaries of science, and very generously so, without sort of really looking for personal gain out of it. So I think from that point of view, he was a very generous scientist, and should be looked on in more a better light than perhaps he is. And if you want to read more about him, there is the fantastic book, The Multifarious Mr. Banks, which goes into a lot more detail about his life, particularly the sort of post-Cook era, which I find particularly fascinating. But thank you very much for listening, and I hope that may have teased some interest in you about Mr. Banks.
Thank you so much again, Toby. It's just been wonderful to hear you speak again with such passion about your subject. I know that we're all looking forward to the time when we can travel overseas again and have you lead one of our groups as a botanical guide. We can't wait. And if you're interested at home to learn more about Banks, then Toby's book is available for purchase through bookshops and online, and I will include a link to this in the email. Or perhaps you might like to join our new cruise, The Botanical Wonders of Tropical North Queensland, where you'll follow in some of the footsteps that Banks made on this inaugural voyage to Australia that we spoke about earlier. But thank you so much, Toby, for joining me today.
Hi, thanks, Carly. It's a real pleasure, and very much looking forward to getting out there and taking some Botanica keen botanists out on some tours.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.